As business delegations from both China and the United States visit one another, what does this mean for trade relations between the two nations? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In its latest push to showcase a commitment to further developing and enhancing trading opportunities between China and the United States, the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade hosted a networking forum in New York. It partnered with the Chinese Consulate in the city, along with other trade groups. Karina Mitchell has this report.
Welcome to the U.S.-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Forum.
It was a moment to connect and contemplate the importance of cooperation between the world's two largest economies. Speaking at the U.S.-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Forum in New York, the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade stressed the importance of strengthening mutual cooperation.
China and the U.S. enjoy strong economic complementarities and have highly interwoven interests. Strengthening supply chain cooperation between the two sides is conducive to keeping the global industrial and supply chain stable and unfettered, and will contribute to economic growth of the two countries and beyond.
It was a sentiment echoed by other attendees.
Our continued partnership will not only enhance bilateral relations, but also contribute to global economic stability and growth.
The Council believes the bonds between the two countries are growing.
The common interests between China and the U.S. are increasing instead of decreasing. Whether in traditional areas like trade and agriculture, or emerging areas like climate change and artificial intelligence, companies of both countries have shared interests and broad cooperation prospects.
China just unveiled an ambitious economic vision for the future at its third plenum. That includes a commitment to advancing new quality productive forces through innovation, advanced scientific research, and technology. And the world's second largest economy saw industrial profits rise at a faster clip last month, according to the National Bureau of Statistics.
But speakers and attendees here were clear-eyed, noting that China's pioneering long-term goals and hopes for increased mutual cooperation between the U.S. and China do come with challenges.
Geopolitical situation in the world is not so good to everyone. People are all worried about, particularly business people are worried about the risks from Russian-Ukraine war and the crisis in Middle East, which all have a very negative impact.
Attendees were hopeful that fostering new business opportunities between China and the U.S. will lead to continued economic cooperation and growth for China, the U.S., and the globe.
I'm very confident in the future cooperation between the United States and China.
Karina Mitchell, CGTN, New York.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Pennsylvania, Anthony Moretti is an associate professor of communication and organizational leadership at Robert Morris University. Out of Boston, Jorge Heine is a former ambassador of Chile to China and a research professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. In Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asian Narratives. And Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Victor, this was the first Chinese business delegation to visit the United States this year. What are your expectations?
Thank you very much. Personally, I hope the more such exchanges between China and the United States, the better, because there is indeed a huge amount of misunderstanding, especially in the United States, towards the realities here in China, including in the business sector, mainly because the maximum pressure applied by the Biden administration and prior to that by the Trump administration. And a cumulative effect of this maximum pressure against China is actually taking a toll on the business community in the United States, whether in terms of investment in China diverting some of the investments from China to other parts of the world and try to so-called de-risk or manage the risk of the China market, especially in the framework of geopolitical tension between China and the United States. Therefore, such visit is absolutely necessary and very timely, and I hope it will contribute to better understanding between the business communities of the two countries and also figuring out a way and the pathway forward as to what China and the United States, especially the respective business communities, can do to overcome whatever misunderstandings there is between the two countries and try really to get on top of the task of improving business exchanges. It is mentioned that China and U.S. economies are highly complementary to each other, and both countries can make a good effort to make sure that the long-term trade relations between the two countries can be more balanced, rather than hugely tilted in favor of one country and for the other country to suffer a huge trade deficit. Therefore, I think such visits will be very important and will contribute to the overall more peaceful and constructive relations between China and the United States.
Anthony Moretti, great to see you, Anthony. On this trip, the Chinese delegation plans to address the American business community about new economic and trade initiatives. What is your sense of what these initiatives will be and how they would impact this trade relationship between the U.S. and China?
Einar, good to see you as well. I think we're at a very critical time. China came off the very successful third plenum. We know that it has set a clear expectation for goals for 2029, 2035, and 2049. And so I think one of the questions that will inevitably come up is just how committed will either a President Trump or a President Harris be to the highly ineffective and unnecessary tariffs. I think another question that is inevitable and would need to be addressed both during and then after the visit is how exactly can the two business communities put significant pressure on the U.S. to say, look, you might think tariffs sound strong, and from a public relations standpoint, maybe they do. But the reality is the tariffs harm the American public. They harm American businesses. They harm Chinese businesses. They just simply are not the way to go. And so I think the messaging that needs to come out of this is one that says, look, the business communities in these two countries are ready to deal on an equal and fair playing field. That's what China wants. That's what the United States wants. At least that's what the business communities want in both countries. It's incumbent now on Washington to get behind this and recognize that trying to put any sort of barriers in place, again, is simply unnecessary and damages both sides.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, the United States and China commemorated 45 years of diplomatic relations this year. U.S. President Biden, as well as Chinese President Xi Jinping, met on the sidelines of the APEC summit last year, and that meeting was a very positive meeting. It seemed very promising, the way ahead. So how would you assess the current trade climate, the trade atmosphere between China and the U.S.?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And it seems to me the real crux of the matter is this. Here we're dealing with the two largest economies in the world. Combined, they represent 40% of the world's GDP. So there is no ignoring the fact that this is an absolutely crucial relationship. Trade between the two has reached somewhere around $600 billion. At some point, it reached almost $700 billion. So it has enormous significance. Now, I will say this. The key here has been that this trade that has existed between China and the United States has been very beneficial for both parties. Now, I am concerned about, as the previous speaker mentioned, about the prospect of even further tariffs. Mr. Trump has indicated that in his administration, he would impose a 10% tariff on all goods imported to the United States and a 60% tariffs on all goods coming from China. Obviously, that would have a very detrimental effect on this trade. And moreover, he has indicated that he might look at tariffs as a way to increase revenue and eventually even eliminate the US income tax and getting all the fiscal revenue from tariffs rather than from the income tax. Obviously, that is something that was quite common in the 19th century, but it's certainly not adequate for the 21st century. So that, it seems to me, is a big concern. Hopefully, it will not come to happen, but we should certainly keep it on our radar.
Einar, Tangen, of course, there are varying views on what is going on in this trade and economic relationship between these two countries, the two biggest economies in the world. He Weiwen, who is a distinguished research fellow at the Shanghai Institute for American Studies and co-director of the China Association of International Trade Centers for China, U.S. and European Union Studies. This is what he had to say, and I'm quoting him here. He said, "No matter how tense the relationship between China and the United States is, and how severe economic frictions are, bilateral trade has bottomed out after falling for several quarters." Now, if we look at what's happened recently, I mean, just last month, the U.S. slapped new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, on advanced batteries, on solar cells as well, steel, aluminium, and medical equipment as well. And we heard the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, say that China has, to use her words, over-concentrated supply chains, and which may interfere significantly with our efforts to build a healthy economic relationship. So lots happening here. I mean, how do you see this relationship evolving?
Well, Janet Yellen is coming straight out of the 70s. These are the exact things that were said about Japan at that time. So, yeah, I mean, it's an opinion. It's not really grounded in fact. The issue is that China outcompeted the U.S. and EU in areas that they chose to ignore. And they simply have, plowed ahead. And it's not surprising. They have more engineers. They concentrate more on STEM studies and things like this. So, yeah, it's not surprising. In terms of what this all means in terms of policy, you can't walk away from the relationship. It doesn't matter if there's a desire. You can certainly put a lot of pressure on tech and information sharing and a certain amount of finance. But the fact is, as shown by the U.S. Deficit, if it's not bought from China, it has to be bought from somewhere else. These are industries that are not coming back to the United States. Sneakers and sweaters are not going to be made to somewhere in the Midwest. So, the issue here really isn't about China. It is about the U.S. Reestablishing its economic base. And quite frankly, China can help. When I talk about you cannot separate these two, even the military buys such a huge percentage of their goods, intermediate goods from China, they would be completely hamstrung if there was, in fact, a complete cessation of these types of goods coming to the United States. So, I mean, this is a lot of politics. Let's hope reality sets in afterwards. Trump's idea that he can fund the United States off of tariffs doesn't work. Tariffs will go to where? The consumers, and they will be the ones hit. So it doesn't matter how much he raises. He's just going to increase the pain on them in a kind of downward spiral. So at this point, I think it's great that you have a group like this that is so positive about the possibilities. Hopefully, U.S. businesses see the same.
Victor, the U.S.-China Business Council also wrapped up a 3-day visit to China on July 23rd, and that was after the conclusion of the third plenum. That was the key meeting where the CPC discusses reforms for the years ahead. This is what Roberta Lipson, founder of United Family Healthcare, had to say about that trip. Let's listen.
In general, the American business community wants to be really clear that we value the China market. And we value collaborative and friendly relations between the US and China, and that we are aware that each side has their legitimate security concerns, but there's vast room for productive engagement in trade and investment, and collaborations that we can have that will certainly accrue to the benefit of the people of both countries.
So what do you make of that statement, Victor? Do you agree with it?
I know Roberta. She's well known in the American business community here in China and a good spokesman for the AmCham in Beijing. I think she is talking about the realities involving China-U.S. trade. These two countries can really further increase their bilateral trade by a big margin. Let me make one brief point. Donald Trump has been talking about slapping more tariffs on China export to the United States and eventually try to make sure that China-U.S. trade become more balanced. But the method he is talking about is to really reducing the overall volume of China-U.S. trade. We can actually try to achieve more balanced trade between China and the United States by increasing the bilateral trade volume. For example, if China and the United States set the new goal of increasing the bilateral trade volume to, let's say, $1 trillion, then the additional about $300 billion goods to be added to the bilateral trade will come more from the United States exporting to China, eventually leading to a more balanced trade. This probably will be better. I hope Donald Trump can really take a good lesson about what tariff is. Tariff is exactly a form of taxation among the American consumers. And the tariffs placed on Chinese exports to the United States significantly increase the inflation in the United States, which is still yet to be fully contained and tamed in the United States. Now, we need to be honest about what this tariff is. And if the United States really wants to resort to tariffs to kind of achieve the more balanced trade between China and the United States, it's like drinking poison, try to satisfy your thirst. It's the wrong way to do. And I hope either Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump or Madam Harris will really learn the basic ingredients of international trade, 1, 2, 3, before they really implement and decide on important government decisions. The more trade between China and the United States, it will be better for both China and the United States. I personally strongly support the more balanced trade between our two countries, and it really takes two to tango. The United States need to come up with more goods, high quality, and the China market really needs. And if we hit on the magic button, the demand in the China market will be huge enough to satisfy for the supply from the United States. And it will help create more jobs in the United States.
Anthony, as Einar said a moment ago, a lot of this, of course, is about politics, but we're seeing something else as well. I mean, if we look at this, we're seeing business-to-business cooperation between the two nations, as well as city-to-city cooperation. We got the river dialogue between Shanghai and New York wrapping up last week. The event's theme at that event was common ideals and common future. So if we look at it at that level, if we see it through businesses, cities, even states, is that where we're going to see this relationship, this trade and economic relationship grow?
I think we will, and to be honest, I think we have year on year, decade on decade. The reality is the business community understands clearly the benefits that will accrue for the United States, the benefits that will accrue for China, the benefits, frankly, that will accrue for the entire world. Whether when you focus on open, fair, free trade for all parties. I go back to a conversation that you and I have had before. This idea of the open hand always beats the closed fist, and the open hand that the business community continues to deliver, whether you're talking about the Chinese business community or the American business community, is consistent. They want more trade. And I would be willing to bet that if you got every chief executive of a United States corporation in a room and said, listen, one of the conversations that China had recently was high quality development, high quality products. Do you believe you can create and export some of those to China? I think everyone in that room would say absolutely. And I think that is the message that's going to have to come out and must continue to come out, that the benefits are there. They always, always, always are more important and more valuable than any negativity. And if you truly want to help both countries continue to prosper, then you have to do it with open, fair, and free trade. China's not talking about tariffs. The United States is.
Ambassador, let's talk about the security concerns that both countries have and how those concerns impact their trade and economic relationship. Very recently, on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum in Laos, there was a meeting between the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, with the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. It was a very robust meeting in which they both addressed their relative security concerns. But what role does security play in growing the trade relationship?
Well, these concerns on the part of Washington and of Beijing are very legitimate. I think it is important that they be discussed and aired as they have between Secretary Blinken and Minister Wang Yi. But at the same time, it is important to understand that they shouldn't stand in the way of more trade between China and the United States. I mean, for example, the United States has identified certain products on which it has imposed restrictions, embargoes, and so on, to be exported to China because they have military or defense implications. And that is obviously a legitimate concern. At the same time, sometimes we see this extended to other areas, like, for example, electric vehicles that have obviously little to do with security. So the expression that Mr. Jake Sullivan has used for this, the National Security Advisor to President Biden, of a high fence, small yard, by which he means that only a few products will be included in these restrictions, seems to be expanding. And that, it seems to me, can be a real problem, because soon it really affects the trade and investment relationship between both countries. So I would argue very strongly that it is important to discriminate between certain things that are legitimate security concerns and other areas in trade and investment that have really very little to do with defense and security. And it seems to me that if that can be done, there can be forward movement in the bilateral trade and investment relationship.
Einar, Tangen, looking at some of the other numbers here, China-U.S. trade increased 231-fold between 1979 and 2023, reaching $575 billion. We also know that more than 40% of American companies have a very positive view of the Chinese market, and that's despite the political rhetoric that we hear out of Washington so often. China is the third largest exporter to the U.S. So if we look at those figures, I mean, how does all of that, I mean, we're talking about trade between China and the United States, but we also know that China is one of the main drivers of global growth. So how significant is that?
Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is quite frankly the fact that Washington has this idea that a containment policy will keep it in charge of the world. But it's not proving, just like the wars did not really help. So, this idea that somehow China wants the U.S. to fail is false. China does not want to give up a huge market, which consumes about 17–18% of the world's GDP. So it's just a question of attitude at this point. Does the business lobby have the wherewithal to try to change attitudes in Washington, D.C., and help them understand that the U.S. needs to compete and it needs to grow, as Anthony said, and also as Victor. This is about trying to do better, not trying to, in essence, break the legs of your opponent because you can't run or don't think you can run as fast as they can.
Victor, if we look at some of the broad policy goals that have been expressed by Chinese leaders over the past few weeks, I mean, we hear very often about economic and trade reform. We hear about opening up of the economy. And as China begins to implement those policies, what does an open Chinese economy look like?
Well, I think one of the key messages from the third plenum is continued reform and opening to the outside world. And the third plenum listed about 300 major initiatives to be implemented in the coming 5 years, all the way leading up to 2030. 2029. And I would say by the end of the 2029, China will be more opened and foreign investments will be more welcomed. And any restrictions, if any, on foreign investment, for example, in terms of the new automobile makers, EV car makers, etc., by foreign investments into China will be more or less eliminated. And foreign companies can really enjoy up to 100% ownership in doing business in China. And import and export will be more normalized and rationalized. And access to the Chinese market will be more opened up. So I think China will be much more integrated with the rest of the world in the coming 5 years. And the new investments, FDI flow into China will be encouraged to be in the high-tech and innovative and creative businesses, for example, because China now has identified the so-called new qualitative productivity as the new megatrend going forward, meaning China wants to focus on creativity and innovation in whatever it is doing in the traditional agriculture industry, manufacturing, high-tech, you name it. So the country is talking about a complete transformation of itself to really plunge much deeper into the digital economy and AI economy.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Naidu in Washington, D.C.